Hey everyone! Today we're diving into the story of the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 CE, an event that shaped the relationship between the Roman Empire and the people of Judea. Now, to understand how it all began, let's talk about the Roman Empire first. In the early 1st century, Rome was seen as this unstoppable force, expanding across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. They had this well-oiled military machine, and wherever they went, they brought Roman political control with them, creating a balance of power between their military might and their culture. Rome didn't just conquer, they also brought their way of life, which included things like entertainment, trade, technology, and even their religion. Some people under Roman rule were okay with that trade-off. Sure, they gave up certain freedoms, like religious freedom, but in return, they got things like sanitation and order. Sounds like a decent deal, right? Well, not for everyone. Let's zoom in on Palestine. By this time, the region had been heavily influenced by Greek culture, thanks to the Seleucid Empire back in the day. When the Romans took over, it wasn't just about culture anymore. It became a mess of politics, corruption, and class divides. You had the Jewish elite, who were mostly Hellenized, meaning they had adopted Greek customs and values, and they were cool with Roman rule because it helped them maintain their fancy lifestyles. The local Greek population and these Hellenized Jews got to enjoy the best Rome had to offer. The Jewish upper class, especially the Sadducees, who held power in the Sanhedrin, the ruling council, did everything they could to keep things as they were, and they even defended Herod, the puppet king placed by Rome. But here's the thing. Not all Jews were on board with this cozy arrangement. The Pharisees, for example, couldn't stand how Hellenism and Roman influence kept creeping into Jewish life. Over time, some of them may have even morphed into the Zealots, who were hardcore against Roman rule. So, within the Jewish community itself, there was already this deep divide, and Rome had unintentionally made it worse. Now, if that wasn't enough, you had the Roman governors and the local Jewish authorities, many of whom were just straight-up corrupt. They ignored the everyday struggles of the common Jewish people. Most of the wealth generated in the markets of Jerusalem, that didn't go back into the local economy. Instead, it went straight into the pockets of the elites, which only fueled the anger of the average Jewish person even more. One of the best sources we have on this is the historian Josephus, a Jewish man who actually fought in the revolt. According to him, the Roman governors in Judea were pretty much the worst. Their corruption and cruelty mirrored the attitude of the Roman emperors themselves. One of the most infamous examples was Pontius Pilate, who took over as governor of Jerusalem around 27 CE. He and Emperor Tiberius both had zero respect for the Jewish people. Pilate even tried to introduce a new religious cult to replace Judaism, making an already bad situation even worse. By the time we get to 64 CE, another guy named Gessius Florus was in charge of Judea. If you thought Pilate was bad, Florus was worse. He had the same indifference to the Jewish population, but he lacked any political skill to manage the growing tensions. Josephus straight up calls him incompetent. And it's no surprise that under Florus, things quickly spiraled out of control. And by 66 CE, the tension between the Jewish population and the Romans had reached a boiling point. The corruption, the class divide, and the outright disrespect for the Jewish people finally sparked a full-blown rebellion. It all started in Caesarea, where the Zealots, these fiercely anti-Roman, anti-elite Jews, kicked off the revolt by wiping out the Roman-backed Greek elite in the area. This was the first real punch in what would become a brutal conflict. And then, Gessius Florus, who was already hated by the Jewish people, decided to make things worse. He plundered the Holy Temple in Jerusalem to fund his own version of the cult of Caesar, using the sacred wealth to erect statues of Emperor Nero and even himself. Now, the temple wasn't just any old building. It was the heart and soul of Jewish religious and social life. So, when Florus raided it, he didn't just take money, he basically insulted the entire Jewish faith. That was the final straw, and soon after, the Jewish people rose up in rebellion. Attacks on Roman citizens spread like wildfire throughout Judea, especially in the northern towns. The rebels were gaining ground, and in places like Narbata, they even managed to overthrow Roman rule. In response, Rome sent legions from Syria to crush the uprising. At first, the Romans seemed to have the upper hand, taking control of northern Judea and Galilee pretty easily. But they made a big mistake. They spread themselves too thin. The rebels ambushed them at the Battle of Ben Horon and handed the Romans a humiliating defeat, forcing them to retreat back to Syria. As you can imagine, Emperor Nero wasn't pleased. He sent one of his top generals, Vespasian, along with his son Titus, to crush the revolt for good. They came back with a much larger force and unleashed brutal punishment. Vespasian's army wiped out nearly every Jewish rebel in Caesarea and northern Galilee, either killing them or selling them into slavery. Around 10,000 Jews were either dead or enslaved. But the fight wasn't over. Many rebels fled to Jerusalem, where the Jewish resistance was still strong. The rebels stopped paying taxes, and the Zealots, along with a faction known as the Sicarii, launched deadly attacks on Roman soldiers stationed in the city. They even managed to overrun the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, which gave the Jewish people a huge morale boost. Support for the Zealots grew rapidly within the city, but by 67 CE, the tide had already started to turn. Vespasian and Titus took back almost all of Judea, crushing what was left of the rebellion. Strongholds like Jodapatha fell after brutal sieges, and soon the Romans were marching on Jerusalem. Inside the city, panic was spreading. The Jewish leaders, mainly the Sadducees, knew they were outmatched and begged the Zealots to surrender to avoid further bloodshed. But the Zealots, led by the fanatical John of Giscala, weren't having it. They wanted an all-out war and refused to back down. The Zealots went so far as to execute any moderate leaders who advocated for peace. They even hung their bodies in public to make it clear that surrender was not an option. By 68 CE, most of the moderate Jewish leaders had been killed, not by the Romans, but by their fellow Jews. Just as the Romans were about to lay siege to Jerusalem, a civil war broke out back in Rome. Vespasian became emperor in 69 CE, and Titus took command of the siege. By 70 CE, the Romans were at Jerusalem's gates, and the Zealots were growing desperate. In a last-ditch effort to rally the population, they burned the city's food supplies, hoping to force everyone to fight. And it worked. Thousands of men, women, and children joined the defense of the city, but it also led to widespread starvation. The Romans, knowing they couldn't storm the city right away, set up camp outside and began a slow, methodical siege. They crucified anyone who tried to escape, sending a terrifying message to those still inside. The Jews inside the walls had no choice, fight or face a brutal death. After 7 long months, the Romans finally broke through the walls. In the summer of 70 CE, they flooded into the city, forcing the Zealots into brutal street battles. The Romans were unstoppable, burning everything in their path and slaughtering anyone who resisted. The final stand came at the temple, where the Zealots and Sicarii retreated. After several failed attempts to breach the walls, the Roman soldiers set fire to the holy temple itself. For the Jewish people, this was the ultimate devastation. The temple, which had been the heart of their faith, was gone, burned to the ground. It was a crushing blow, not just militarily but spiritually. By September 70 CE, Jerusalem was in Roman hands. The city was plundered, the Jewish resistance was crushed, and over 1 million Jewish people had been killed, according to Josephus. Many were sold into slavery, with around 70,000 Jewish slaves being forced to help build the Roman Colosseum. The destruction of the temple marked the end of an era for the Jewish people and the start of a new chapter, Rabbinic Judaism, where rabbis took on a central role in the religion and synagogues replaced the temple as the focal point of Jewish life.